He knocked on the door on April 3rd, 2023 at 2:58 in the afternoon. He'd flown across the country to see her. They'd been talking for 8 months. He had flowers in his hand and love in his heart. When the door finally opened after a 20-minute wait, he saw her face and his entire world shattered in an instant. Because the woman standing in front of him wasn't the woman in the pictures, not even close. Everything about this moment was different from what he'd imagined. The room behind her, the way she looked at him, the silence that fell between them. And in that single moment, 8 months of trust collapsed. Within the next hour, his shock would turn into betrayal. His betrayal would turn into rage. And that rage would leave one life ended and one life destroyed permanently. But what was she hiding all this time? Why would a man who demanded honesty above everything else snap so completely? And what happens when the life you built online collides with the devastating reality waiting on the other side of a door? Before moving on, a quick thank you to everyone watching and supporting this channel. Your presence truly keep it alive. This community continue to grow because of people who believe in real and meaningful storytelling. Please make sure you subscribe to channel. Your support makes a real difference, and we love to know who's here. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If you still haven't done, do it right now. Write "I'm still here" in the comment. Let's see who's watching till the end. Don't forget to like this video too. Now let's continue to understand why Caleb Morgan would one day pick up a glass object and change the course of multiple lives. We need to go back to where his story truly began. Not on that April afternoon in Houston, but years earlier, in a modest home in Columbus, Ohio, where a man's fundamental beliefs about trust were being formed. Caleb's father, Robert Morgan, worked as a truck driver for a regional logistics company. He spent his days navigating highways across the Midwest, delivering packages and freight across hundreds of miles. His mother, Carol, worked as a registered nurse at Mount Carmel Hospital, often working double shifts to help make ends meet. They were hard-working people, the kind of Americans who believed in showing up and following through on their commitments. Robert Morgan had a saying that he repeated to young Caleb more times than the boy could count. He'd say it while teaching him how to tie his shoes, while watching him struggle with his algebra homework, while standing in the driveway on a Saturday afternoon. If you say something, Caleb, you do it. A man's word is everything. You can lose your money, you can lose your house, you can lose everything you own, but your word, that's the one thing nobody can take from you if you don't let them. Carol reinforced this lesson in gentler ways, sitting with her son at the kitchen table and telling him that honesty, even when it hurt, was always the better choice than a comfortable lie. She'd say things like, "The world will test your honesty. It will tempt you to take shortcuts, to tell people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear. Don't fail that test." These weren't abstract moral lessons in the Morgan household. They were the actual currency of the family's values. Honesty wasn't optional. It was foundational. It was everything. By the time Caleb reached his early 40s, those lessons had calcified into something deeper than a personality trait. They'd become the lens through which he evaluated every relationship, every interaction, every person who entered his life. When Caleb turned 35, he'd already established himself as someone people in Columbus could depend on. He'd been promoted to a warehouse operations supervisor position at a major regional retailer, overseeing the logistics of inventory movement, managing teams of younger workers, and handling the kind of operational problems that required both leadership and precision. His coworkers described him as the guy who showed up early, stayed late, never complained, and never asked anyone to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. He had a modest townhouse on the north side of Columbus. Nothing fancy, but it was his. He'd saved for the down payment, worked overtime to pay the mortgage, and took pride in the fact that he'd built something for himself without cutting corners or asking for handouts. His best friend was a man named Darren Cole, someone he'd known since high school. Darren was everything Caleb wasn't. He was loud where Caleb was quiet. He told jokes at work until people were laughing so hard they had to take breaks. He had a way of walking into a room and making it feel smaller because he took up so much space with his personality. But beneath that extroversion was someone fiercely loyal, someone who remembered the important dates in your life and showed up when you needed him. The two men had been through things together over the years, relationships that didn't work out, jobs that disappointed them, the kind of ordinary heartbreaks that come with being a man trying to figure out how to live. And despite their opposite personalities, they'd remained tethered to each other through it all. But before Caleb was anyone's supervisor or homeowner, he'd been someone's boyfriend. His first serious relationship was with a woman named Rachel Thompson. They met through mutual friends in the late 90s and dated for nearly 2 years. Rachel was warm and outgoing, the kind of person who made Caleb feel less alone in his own quietness. He imagined a future with her. He thought about marriage and maybe someday having kids. He believed they were building something real together. But in the spring of 2001, Caleb opened his mailbox and found a letter from a collection agency. The letter was addressed to him, and it outlined credit card debt in his name that totaled just over $8,000. He read it 3 times, thinking there must be a mistake. There wasn't. When he confronted Rachel, she admitted that she'd opened store credit cards without his permission, used them to purchase things she wanted, and simply never told him about it. When he asked her why, she said something that would echo through the rest of his life. "I didn't tell you because I knew if I did, you'd leave me." Caleb didn't leave immediately. Instead, he spent the next 8 months working overtime shifts, skipping lunches, taking on extra responsibilities at work, all to pay off debt he didn't create. He paid it back in full by August of that year, and then he ended the relationship. The financial wound healed relatively quickly. It was money after all, and money could be earned back. But the emotional wound was deeper. Rachel had made a fundamental decision about his character without giving him a choice in the matter. She'd decided that he would leave her, and then she'd shaped her behavior around that assumption. She'd lied not because she needed to, but because she judged him and found him wanting. That hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the dollars and cents. 4 years passed. Caleb dated casually during those years. Nothing serious, nothing that required the kind of vulnerability he'd given to Rachel. Then in 2005, he met a woman named Maya through friends at a social gathering. Maya was quieter than Rachel, more introspective, and Caleb thought that maybe he'd learned something from his first major heartbreak. 6 months into the relationship, Caleb asked Maya why they always seemed to spend time at his place and rarely at hers. She gave vague answers. She'd say things like, "My roommate situation is complicated right now," or "I'm in the middle of a lease," or "Let's just focus on us here." Caleb didn't press her initially. He wanted to trust her, but eventually his curiosity won out, and he decided to surprise her by picking her up at her house. What he found when he arrived was a living situation that looked nothing like what she'd described. Maya didn't have a roommate situation. She had an ex-boyfriend who still lived in the house. They had separate bedrooms, but they shared everything else: the kitchen, the living room, their lives. When Caleb confronted her about it, Maya broke down and admitted that she'd been living with her ex-boyfriend the entire time they'd been together. She'd hidden it because she thought Caleb would judge her. She'd let him believe something untrue because she was afraid of what the truth might cost her. This second deception hit Caleb differently than the first one had. With Rachel, the lie had been about what she did to him without his knowledge. With Maya, the lie was about what she was hiding from him. It was a lie by omission, a lie built on silence and misdirection. And Caleb realized something that would define the rest of his emotional life. He'd missed this deception entirely. He'd let his guard down after years of caution, and someone had exploited that vulnerability. He'd trusted, and that trust had been weaponized against him. By 2009, at the age of 27, Caleb had experienced 2 serious relationships. In both, honesty, the one value his parents had instilled as sacred, had been violated in fundamentally different ways. 2 women, 2 lies, 2 failures of trust. The pattern was established, and it would haunt him for the next decade. By the time Caleb reached his early 40s, he'd made a quiet peace with solitude. He wasn't bitter about it. He wasn't angry at women or at the world. He simply accepted that the kind of honesty he needed seemed to exist somewhere beyond his reach. He had his work, which provided structure and purpose. He had Darren, whose friendship never required him to lower his guard completely. He had his townhouse, his routines, his predictable life. He'd resigned himself to this existence until one Friday night in late 2022, when everything changed over wings and beer at their usual spot. Darren slid his phone across the table and said something that would set the entire tragedy in motion. Look, I met her on here, and before you roll your eyes and tell me online dating is a minefield, just listen. You've spent the last 15 years protecting yourself from people who lie, but what if you met someone who didn't? What if you just gave it one shot? Caleb had no idea that his best friend was about to push him toward the one person whose deception would break him in ways he'd never imagined possible. While Caleb Morgan was sitting in Columbus, Ohio, downloading a dating app after years of solitude, a woman named Elena Cruz was in Houston, Texas, staring at her reflection in a mirror and making a decision that would reshape her entire life. To understand Elena, we need to go back much further than that moment. We need to go back to when she was a child, when the world hadn't yet taught her to hide. Elena was born in Houston in 1990 to parents who loved her with a fierceness that defined her earliest years. Her mother, Margaret, was a registered nurse who worked at Texas Children's Hospital, spending her days caring for sick kids with a gentleness that came naturally to her. Her father, Carlos, was a construction worker who built homes across the Houston area, a man with calloused hands and a soft voice who'd emigrated from Mexico as a teenager with nothing but determination and a willingness to work. Together, they created a household filled with the kind of warmth that comes from people who've struggled and decided that struggle would never diminish their capacity to love. Elena had an older brother, Miguel, and the three of them grew up in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business and nobody minded much. In those early years, Elena was simply Elena. She was a child who loved books, who spent hours in the Houston Public Library getting lost in fantasy novels and fairy tales. She had friends from school and church, kids who played with her without question or comment. She was a good student, the kind of girl who raised her hand in class and got straight A's on her report cards. In photographs from those years, she's smiling genuinely, unselfconsciously, the way children smile when they don't yet understand that their bodies might be something to be ashamed of. Her parents took her to church on Sundays at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, where Father Miguel knew her by name. They celebrated her birthdays with cake and streamers in the backyard. They took family vacations to the coast where she played in the sand like any other child. For the first 15 years of her life, Elena's height, she grew to be 3 feet 2 inches tall, was simply a fact about her, like having brown eyes or preferring chocolate to vanilla. It mattered only in the way that all physical characteristics matter when you're young, and the world hasn't yet decided to weaponize them. Then she turned 16, and everything changed. The shift was gradual at first, subtle enough that Elena couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Boys who'd been her friends in middle school suddenly looked at her differently. Their eyes would linger, but not with the warmth of friendship. They'd make comments under their breath that other kids would laugh at, comments she wasn't sure she was meant to hear. Strangers in grocery stores would stare. Teachers who'd treated her like any other student began treating her like she was somehow more fragile, more in need of protection. At school dances, she'd stand against the wall and watch other girls dance with boys, while the boys around her seemed to look right through her, or worse, looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. By the time she was 18, Elena had learned a devastating truth. Her body was no longer simply her body. It had become a thing that other people saw before they saw her. It had become the first and, for many people, the only thing that mattered. This realization crystallized at age 22 when she met a man named David Martinez at a coffee shop near her apartment. David was charming and attentive, and for the first time in years, Elena felt genuinely chosen by someone. They dated for 6 months, and in private, David was everything she'd been hoping for. He was affectionate and funny. He'd bring her coffee in the morning and sit with her on the couch watching old movies. He'd hold her hand and tell her she was beautiful. He made her feel seen in a way that mattered. But the moment they stepped outside her apartment, everything shifted. He wouldn't hold her hand in public. When they ran into his friends, he'd introduce her as my friend Elena, with an emphasis on friend that felt like a blade. When she asked him why he was ashamed of her, he couldn't look her in the eye. He just said something vague about complicated feelings and needing time. Elena realized the terrible truth. David loved the version of her that existed only behind closed doors. The version the world didn't have to see. The version that allowed him to feel noble and accepting while keeping her hidden from the people he actually cared about. That relationship ended in the summer of 2013, and with it ended something fundamental in Elena's belief about love. She stopped believing that someone could accept all of her, not just her mind or her humor or her kindness, but her actual body, the things she lived in every single day. She learned to be suspicious of romantic attention because she understood now that sometimes affection was just a cover for shame. Sometimes love was conditional on invisibility. By her late 20s, Elena had essentially withdrawn from the dating world. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was more like a slow fade, a gradual acceptance that this part of life simply wasn't available to her. Instead, she built a different kind of life. She moved into a small converted backyard unit behind her cousin Rosa's house in a quiet Houston neighborhood. Rosa, who worked as a medical assistant and had always been protective of Elena, helped her set up the space. The cottage was one room with a kitchenette, modest but thoughtfully designed. The counters were at Elena's height. Step stools were lined against the walls. Grab bars were installed in the bathroom. Every detail was practical, a testament to Rosa's love, but also a constant reminder that the world outside wasn't built for Elena's body. The frosted glass windows provided privacy and isolation in equal measure. Outside those windows was a world that had rejected her. Inside was safety, but also loneliness. Elena worked as a freelance marketing assistant and copywriter, taking contracts from small businesses who hired her remotely. The work was unstable. Sometimes she'd have 3 projects running simultaneously. Other times she'd go weeks between assignments. The pay was modest, enough to cover her portion of rent and basic expenses, but never quite enough to feel secure. The advantage of remote work was obvious. She never had to leave the house. She never had to endure the stares or the comments or the way people's faces would shift when they saw her in person after only knowing her voice. The disadvantage was equally obvious. She never had to leave the house. Years passed, 1 turned into 2, 2 became 5. By 2022, at the age of 32, Elena realized she'd gone 5 years without being kissed by another person, not by choice, by circumstance and self-protection. Her cousin Rosa tried periodically to set her up with friends or coworkers. Elena would decline politely but firmly. She'd say things like, "I'm not really in a place for that right now," or "I'm focused on my work," or simply, "The world isn't kind to women who look like me." Rosa would push back, insisting that there were good men out there, men who wouldn't judge, men who would see past the surface. Elena appreciated her cousin's optimism, but optimism wasn't the same as reality. Reality was 5 years of solitude. Reality was knowing your body had become an obstacle to connection rather than a vehicle for it. Then in late November of 2022, something shifted inside Elena. The loneliness stopped being abstract and philosophical. It became physical. She found herself sitting in her tiny room on a Thursday night, thinking about all the things she'd never done. She'd never been on a real date where someone was proud to be with her publicly. She'd never experienced the nervousness of a first kiss. She'd never felt the kind of romantic love that didn't come with conditions or shame. She was 33 years old, and she was running out of time to change that. She made a decision that night, one that felt both hopeful and desperate. She decided to try online dating, but differently than most people do. She'd let someone know her first as a person, her personality, her humor, her intelligence, her kindness. She'd share her actual self before revealing the physical reality that had become so loaded with meaning. She told herself, if someone falls in love with who I actually am, maybe they'll be able to accept how I look. Maybe they'll be different. It was a fragile hope, built partly on logic and partly on desperation, and it would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. Elena created a dating profile using photographs from when she was 28 years old. Professional headshots, close-ups of her face. She wasn't lying exactly. Her face was her face. Her expressions were genuine, but she was being selective about what truth she was telling. Her bio read, homebody, I love cooking, movies, and reading. I work remotely as a copywriter. More of an introvert than a party girl. Looking for a genuine connection with someone who values honesty and kindness. There was no mention of her height, no mention of her disability, no mention of the tiny house behind her cousin's property. She told herself a story about why this was acceptable. She would tell him when it felt safe. She would tell him as soon as she sensed that he cared about her as a person. She genuinely believed this. She wasn't planning to deceive anyone permanently. She just needed a chance to be seen as fully human before her body became the defining fact of her existence. In the first few weeks after creating the profile, Elena matched with several men. Most of them had profiles that made her deeply uncomfortable. Men who specifically sought out women with dwarfism, who spoke in ways that made it clear they saw her as a fetish rather than a person. She almost deleted the entire app. And then she saw Caleb Morgan's profile. The photo was clear and genuine. His bio mentioned that he valued honesty above all else. There was something about his straightforwardness that appealed to her, something that made her think maybe, just maybe, this one might be different. She took a breath and sent him a message. Hey Caleb, your profile sounds honest. That's rare here. And with that single message, Elena set off a chain reaction that would lead to April 3rd, 2023, and the moment that would destroy both of their lives. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to enter into 8 months of the most intimate connection either of them had ever experienced. And neither of them understood that the very foundation their connection was built on, honesty, was already fractured beyond repair. Because Elena's secret was growing heavier with every message, and Caleb's need for truth was about to become the most dangerous weapon in either of their hands. Elena's message arrived on Caleb's phone on December 2nd, 2022, just after midnight. He was lying in bed unable to sleep, scrolling through the dating app he'd reluctantly created just 3 days earlier. When he saw her message, "Hey Caleb, your profile sounds honest. That's rare here." He read it twice before responding. He didn't think too hard about it. He simply typed back, "Thanks for reaching out. What makes you think that?" It was a simple question, but it was also the question that would set everything in motion. Elena's response came within minutes, as if she'd been waiting by her phone. Most profiles feel like people are trying to be someone they're not. Yours just feels like you. Caleb went to bed that night thinking about a stranger's words. He woke up the next morning thinking about her. Over the next 4 weeks, they established a rhythm of casual conversation. The topics were deliberately light, the kind of exchanges that let two people test the water without diving too deep. He asked her about her work, and she told him about the instability of freelance copywriting. She asked him what the hardest part of his job was, and he answered honestly, keeping people calm when everything around them is falling apart. When she asked him how he liked to relax, he told her, "I cook sometimes, watch old movies. Not very exciting." She responded with a laugh emoji and wrote, "Not exciting is underrated. Exciting usually means chaos." They talked about their families in broad strokes. He mentioned his parents in Ohio. She mentioned having a cousin who helped her out. Neither of them asked too many personal questions. Neither of them pushed for photographs or video calls. There was something respectful about the pacing, something that felt different from the pressure Caleb had experienced on other dating apps, where women demanded to move to text within minutes or threatened to unmatch if he didn't respond immediately. What Caleb noticed, even in those early exchanges, was that Elena actually listened. When he mentioned that he worked in warehouse operations, she followed up 2 days later by asking if he enjoyed the people management side of the job or if he preferred the logistical puzzle solving. Most people asked questions out of politeness and then forgot the answers. Elena remembered details. She referenced things he'd said in previous conversations. She asked real follow-up questions that suggested she was actually thinking about him between messages. For Elena's part, she found herself genuinely curious about Caleb in a way she hadn't been about anyone in years. He didn't come across as trying too hard. He didn't make inappropriate jokes or ask her to send photos. His responses felt thoughtful, like he was actually considering what she'd written before responding. By the fourth week of January 2023, something shifted in their conversations. The small talk began giving way to something deeper. Caleb told her about Rachel for the first time, about the credit card debt and the lie that had shattered his trust. He explained to her that honesty wasn't just a preference for him, it was foundational. "I don't expect honesty from the world," he wrote, "but from someone I'm building something with, I do. I need that." Elena read that message several times, and each time she felt a knot tightening in her stomach. She knew even then that she was building something with him that wasn't built entirely on honesty, but she responded compassionately, telling him she understood why that mattered so much to him, and that she didn't think less of him for having those wounds. In mid-January, Elena opened up about her own past hurts. She told him about David, about the 6 months of private affection and public shame. She wrote, "There was someone who loved me when nobody was watching, but was ashamed of me the moment the world could see. It taught me that sometimes people's love comes with conditions you don't know about until you've already invested everything." Caleb's response came quickly. "That man was a coward. If I loved you, I'd be proud to be seen with you. I'd want everyone to know." It was meant to be reassuring, but it was also a promise he couldn't possibly keep, because there were aspects of Elena he didn't know yet. There were realities about her life that would fundamentally change how he understood everything she told him. Elena read his words and felt her chest tighten. She wanted to believe him. More than anything, she wanted to believe him. But she was beginning to understand that her carefully constructed plan to reveal the truth gradually was becoming a lie that was growing more complex every single day. By late February, they began video calling. The first call happened on a Thursday night at around 9 p.m. Houston time, 10 p.m. in Columbus. Caleb had set up his laptop in his living room, and Elena had positioned herself on her bed with the camera framed from her shoulders up. They were both nervous. Caleb thought he might be about to discover that her voice didn't match her face, or that something would feel off. Elena was terrified that even through the camera, he would somehow sense something was wrong. But when they connected, something shifted in both of them. Seeing each other's faces made everything real in a way that text and voice calls hadn't. Caleb found himself checking his phone constantly in the days after that first video call, hoping she would initiate another one. Elena rearranged her entire schedule around when Caleb would be home from work, when he'd be free to talk. They fell into a pattern of late-night video calls, sometimes lasting until midnight or past it. They'd talk about everything: their childhoods, movies they loved, fears they'd never told anyone, dreams they'd almost given up on having. During these video calls, Elena became an expert at positioning herself. She sat on her bed or in a chair positioned in ways that hid her full body from view. When Caleb asked her about the step stools and grab bars he could sometimes see in the background of her apartment, she framed it as quirky adaptation. "My kitchen is set up weird," she told him. "Everything's kind of adapted for my personal preferences. I like things at a certain height. It's one of those things that made sense when I moved in, and now I'm just used to it." Caleb didn't press her. He wasn't looking for red flags. He was falling in love, and when you're falling in love, you tend to accept the answers people give you at face value. The emotional intimacy deepened simultaneously with the physical distance. She told him about the loneliness of the past 5 years. He told her about the way his past betrayals had made him afraid to trust anyone. When she said, "You make me feel like I could be loved for everything I am," Caleb felt something break open inside his chest. He responded, "I've never felt this seen before. Not like this." These weren't the words of people casually dating. These were the words of two people who were building something that felt foundational, something that felt like it might finally heal the wounds they've been carrying. Then on March 8, 2023, during a late-night phone call, Caleb asked the question Elena had been dreading for weeks. His voice was gentle but direct. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Elena's heart stopped. She knew exactly what was coming. Caleb continued, "Is there anything about you, anything important, that you haven't told me yet?" The silence on the line stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Elena's mind was racing. She could tell him right now. She could say, "Yes, there is. I need to tell you about my height and my living situation and why I've hidden these things from you." She could explain herself. She could maybe give him context that would make him understand. But fear won. The same fear that had kept her silent for 8 months took over again. Elena forced a small laugh into the phone. "No, not yet," she said. "But I will. Soon, I promise." Caleb wanted to believe her. So he did. He said, "I'd rather hear it from you than find out another way." And Elena, even as she was making that promise, knew she was breaking it. By late March, Caleb had made a decision. He was going to fly to Houston. He told Darren about it over lunch at their usual spot on March 20th. Darren didn't react with excitement the way Caleb might have expected. Instead, he looked serious. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Caleb nodded without hesitation. "As sure as I've ever been about anything." Darren studied his friend's face for a long moment, then said something that would echo through the rest of Caleb's life. "Okay, but if anything feels wrong when you get there, and I mean anything, don't ignore it. Trust your gut." Caleb assured him that nothing would feel wrong. He booked his flight that night for April 3rd. He told Elena about it via text message. "I'm coming to see you. I can't wait anymore." Meanwhile, Elena's panic was reaching a fever pitch. She started drafting confessions in her notes app. "There's something important I need to tell you," she'd type, then delete it. "I need to tell you about my height and my living situation," she'd write, her fingers shaking, then erase it before she could lose her nerve. Each time she considered telling him, fear would spike through her. If she told him now, he might cancel the trip. He might realize he didn't actually want her. But if she waited until he was there, if he could see her in person, maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to look past what she'd hidden. Maybe the 8 months of real connection would matter more than the physical reality she'd kept from him. She was making a calculated decision, though she wouldn't have admitted it to herself that way. She was choosing to let him board a plane, fly 1,000 miles, and knock on her door believing a version of her that didn't exist. By the time Caleb booked his flight, they had exchanged 147 phone calls, their texts and messages numbered in the hundreds. They'd spent roughly 600 hours in conversation over 8 months. They'd invested emotional capital that was impossible to quantify, vulnerability shared, secrets told, hopes expressed, dreams discussed. Two lonely people had found each other in the vast landscape of the internet and built something that felt like salvation to both of them. And at the absolute center of that construction was a fundamental lie, one that Elena couldn't seem to tell and Caleb couldn't seem to imagine existed. As Caleb packed his suitcase on April the 2nd, carefully placing his clothes and the white lilies he'd purchased, Elena sat in her tiny room and made a final attempt to prepare herself for what was coming. She had less than 24 hours to find the courage to tell him the truth. Or she could let him arrive without warning, let his shock and confusion be the vehicle for revelation. Neither option felt survivable, but one of them was about to become the catalyst for something far worse than shame or rejection. One of them was about to trigger a violence neither of them could have predicted. On the morning of April 3rd, 2023, Caleb Morgan woke at 3:47 a.m. without an alarm. His body knew what his mind had been anticipating for weeks. He'd slept only in fragments, his dreams filled with the face he'd seen on video calls and the voice he'd heard in the darkness of late nights. By 4:15 a.m., he'd given up on trying to sleep and gotten out of bed. He showered slowly, methodically, taking his time with details that normally he wouldn't think twice about. He selected a clean blue button-down shirt and dark jeans, nothing that felt like he was trying too hard, but nothing that felt careless either. He wanted to look like a man who cared about this moment without appearing desperate. By 6 a.m., he'd packed his small suitcase twice, repacking it a third time to make sure the white lilies were protected carefully in plastic wrapping so their petals wouldn't bruise during the flight. Darren had texted him at 7:30 a.m. "You good, man?" Caleb responded with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. There weren't words for what he was feeling. It was anticipation and nervousness mixed together. But it was also something deeper, a sense that his life was about to shift on its axis, that the loneliness he'd carried for so long might actually be ending. At 8:45 a.m., Caleb drove to Port Columbus International Airport. The parking lot was beginning to fill with morning travelers, business people heading to conferences, families starting vacations. He checked in his suitcase, passed through security, and arrived at Gate B12 just as Southwest Flight 847 was beginning the boarding process. At 10:02 a.m., the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Caleb had the window seat, 14B, and he spent the entire 3-hour flight staring down at the landscape shifting beneath him, watching Ohio fade away and unknown territory come into view. At 1:47 p.m. Houston time, the wheels of the aircraft touched down at Houston Hobby Airport. Caleb's phone immediately showed a weak cellular signal, and before doing anything else, he texted Elena, "Just landed. Can't believe this is really happening." Her response came within 30 seconds. "Oh my God, I can't wait to see you." But what Caleb didn't know was that Elena was sitting on her bed in her tiny room, staring at those words, feeling the weight of everything she hadn't told him crushing down on her shoulders. She was terrified. She was out of time, and she was about to make the final choice not to tell him the truth. After collecting his carry-on luggage and walking through baggage claim, Caleb opened the Uber app on his phone and requested a ride to the address Elena had given him weeks earlier. The driver who picked him up 7 minutes later was a man in his 60s named Luis. Luis had been driving for Uber for 3 years and had developed the kind of cheerful small talk that comes from speaking to thousands of strangers. As Caleb settled into the back seat, Luis glanced at him in the rearview mirror and asked, "You in Houston for business or pleasure, my friend?" Caleb smiled and said, "Pleasure. I'm meeting someone." Luis's eyes lit up with interest. "Someone special?" he asked. Caleb, feeling slightly embarrassed but also unable to hide his happiness, answered, "Yeah, I hope so." Luis nodded knowingly and launched into a story about how he'd met his wife on a dating website back in the early 2000s, back when people didn't trust the internet the way they do now. He talked about the risks, about catfishing and people who weren't who they claimed to be. Caleb half listened, offering polite responses but not really engaging with the warnings. He was confident that Elena was different. He was certain that 8 months of conversations and video calls had given him a clear picture of who she was. As they drove through Houston's neighborhoods, the scenery gradually shifted from commercial areas to residential streets. Luis followed the GPS directions, turning onto the tree-lined street where Elena lived. The main house came into view first, a single-story structure with weathered siding and a slightly overgrown yard. It was the kind of working-class home you see throughout Houston. Nothing remarkable, nothing that suggested anything unusual was happening inside. But the GPS continued directing them past the main house, down a narrow pathway that ran along the side of the property. As they rounded the corner, Caleb saw it, a small converted backyard unit, barely larger than a garage, with a tiny porch and a door that was noticeably shorter than a standard door frame. Caleb's subconscious mind registered something wrong about the scale of the structure, but his conscious mind dismissed it. Maybe this was temporary housing for her while she was between places. Maybe she'd mentioned this and he'd forgotten. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Luis slowed the car and looked back at Caleb with a slight furrow in his brow. "You sure this is the right place?" he asked. Caleb pulled up the address confirmation on his phone and verified it. "Yeah, this is it," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Luis pulled to the curb and turned to face him. "Good luck, man. I hope she's worth the flight," he said. It was a casual comment, but it would prove to be more accurate than either of them could have known. Caleb gathered his flowers in his small bag, stepped out of the car at exactly 2:47 p.m., and watched as Luis drove away. He was alone now on a quiet Houston street, holding flowers in his hand, standing just feet away from a door that would change everything. He walked the short distance toward the small unit, his heart beginning to race with a mixture of excitement and something else he couldn't quite name. As he got closer, he noticed details that his brain registered but didn't fully process. The curtains on the windows were thick and frosted, blocking any view inside. The door was indeed noticeably shorter than standard height, maybe 6 feet or slightly less. The porch was narrow, barely large enough for two people to stand side by side. He climbed the two small steps and raised his hand to knock. At 2:58 p.m. on April 3rd, 2023, Caleb Morgan knocked on Elena Cruz's door for the first time. The knock was soft, tentative, the knock of a man nervous about what comes next. He waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, with more confidence. From inside the small space, he heard a sound. Not footsteps, but something slower and more labored. He heard what sounded like furniture being moved, or something heavy being dragged across the floor. He heard breathing that sounded strained and difficult. His heart rate picked up. Something wasn't right. He called out, "Elena! It's me! It's Caleb!" There was a muffled response from inside, barely audible through the door. "Coming. Just a minute." But it wasn't a minute. He stood on that porch for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. His initial excitement was being replaced by concern and confusion. He called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. He texted her, "I'm here. Should I wait?" No response. He could hear continued movement inside, the sound of something heavy being repositioned, her breathing continuing in that strained, labored rhythm. He knocked again, this time with urgency in his voice. "Elena? Elena, it's me. Are you okay?" Finally, at 3:19 p.m., after nearly 20 minutes of waiting, Caleb heard the lock click. The door began to open, slowly, more slowly than a normal door opens. It opened only a few inches at first, and a rush of warm air escaped from inside the small space. It wasn't dirty air or foul air. It was the air of a lived-in space, heavy with the accumulated warmth and humidity of a sealed environment. Then the door opened wider, and Caleb Morgan finally saw the woman he'd been talking to for 8 months in complete, three-dimensional reality. Elena was standing in the doorway, barely, her body braced against the doorframe for support. She was 3 feet 2 inches tall. She was standing on a small platform or step that had been built to allow her to reach the door handle. Behind her, the interior of the room was scaled differently than anything Caleb had ever seen. The furniture was miniaturized. The shelves were at waist height on a normal person. Step stools were lined against the walls. Everything was adapted to fit a body that didn't match the world built for average height people. It was the same face he'd seen on video calls, the same eyes, the same features. But it was a completely different reality. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb's brain was scrambling to process what he was seeing, to reconcile the image in his mind with the reality in front of him. Elena's voice was trembling as she spoke. "Hi, Caleb," she said softly, attempting to smile, but her eyes filled with terror. "It's me. It's really me." Caleb stared at her, unable to formulate words. His mouth opened and closed. Finally, his voice emerged, cracked and confused. "How? Elena, how did you not tell me this?" He wasn't angry yet. He was broken. Not once. Not one time in 8 months. Not a single time. Elena reached for his arm, her hand small against his sleeve. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice desperate. "I wanted to tell you, but every time I tried, I got scared. Every man I've ever been honest with, right from the start, they either disappeared or they fetishized me or they made me feel like some kind of joke. I just wanted you to know me first, my actual self, not just my body. I was going to tell you when you got here. I promise. I was going to explain everything." Caleb stepped back, pulling his arm away from her grip. "You were going to tell me when I got here? Elena, I'm here. I've been here for 20 minutes knocking on your door. I flew halfway across the country. I've been thinking about this moment for months. And you decide what I deserve to know? You made that choice for me." His voice was rising now, not with aggression, but with a kind of anguish. "This isn't something small. This isn't a secret you tell someone eventually. This is everything. Your height, your living situation, the way you've adapted your entire life. That's not a detail. That's the foundation of who you are. And you hid it from me. Elena's desperation was becoming frantic. She reached for him again. Please, don't do this. Don't make this about appearance. You said, you said I was beautiful to you. You said you'd be proud to be seen with me. I am the same person you've been talking to for 8 months. I'm still Elena. I'm still me. But Caleb was shaking his head. You're not the same. I don't care about your height, Elena. I care about the lie. I care that you looked me in the eye, over video, through messages, and you let me believe something that wasn't true. 8 months. Do you understand what 8 months of emotional investment means when you're someone like me? When honesty is literally the one thing I need? His voice was trembling now with a mixture of betrayal and humiliation. You didn't just lie about your height. You lied about your life. You lied about your living situation. Everything I believed about you is built on a foundation of deception. I asked you directly. I said, is there anything important I should know? And you said no. You promised me you'd tell me yourself. You broke that promise the moment you made it. He turned toward the steps, toward the yard, needing to get away from the intensity of what he was feeling. Elena grabbed his arm again, this time more firmly. Caleb, please. You can't leave me now, she cried out, her voice cracking. You said we were soulmates. You said soulmates don't just walk away. Please don't leave me like everyone else. That word, soulmates, hit him like a physical blow. It brought back every vulnerable confession he'd made to her. Every time he'd said, I've never felt this way before. Every time she'd said, I see you, Caleb. I really see you. All of those moments, all of that emotional exposure, all of that hope, it had been built on a lie so fundamental that it called everything into question. In that moment, months of betrayal trauma, an uncompromised need for honesty, and sudden humiliation crashed into Caleb Morgan all at once. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His vision seemed to narrow. Everything inside him was screaming, I was lied to. Again. By someone I trusted. Again. On a small shelf beside the porch door, there sat a heavy decorative glass candle jar, the kind people keep for home decor. In one unthinking moment, without planning or intention or understanding the consequences, Caleb reached for it. He didn't decide what would happen next. There was no conscious choice. There was only his hand grabbing the glass and his arms swinging in a moment of pure emotional rupture. The glass connected with the side of Elena's head, with her temple. The sound was sickening, not loud, but final. Elena's body went limp. She collapsed in the doorway, half inside the tiny house, half outside on the porch. The glass jar dropped from Caleb's hand and shattered on the concrete. Time seemed to stop. Caleb's breathing was ragged and shocked. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. He knelt beside Elena, his hands shaking. Elena! Elena, get up! Please! I didn't mean... Just get up! He begged, trying to shake her awake. But she didn't move. There was no response, no sound, no sign of consciousness. Her eyes were open but fixed, looking at nothing. In less than 1 minute, a love story had become a homicide. And what Caleb Morgan did in the next moments would determine whether he'd be remembered as a man broken by deception or as a killer who couldn't control his rage. The choice he made in those seconds of pure panic would echo through courtrooms and legal battles for years to come. Before we continue, I just want to say, if you're still here listening to this story, thank you. This is a new channel. And honestly, every view, every likes, and every subscription means everything. It tells me their stories matter to you the way they matter to me. So if you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Do it now. All right, let's get back to it. For the first few seconds after Elena collapsed, Caleb's mind couldn't process what had just happened. His hands were shaking so violently that when he finally managed to pull his phone from his jacket pocket, he nearly dropped it twice. His fingers fumbled as he tried to unlock the screen. When he finally got it to respond, he dialed 911 with a trembling hand. The phone rang twice before a female dispatcher answered with the calm, professional tone of someone trained to handle emergencies. 911, what is your emergency? She asked. Caleb's voice came out shattered and fragmented, barely recognizable as human language. I, I need help. Something happened. I hit her. I didn't mean to, but I hit her. She's not moving. The dispatcher's voice remained steady. Sir, I need you to calm down and tell me your location. What is your address? Caleb recited the address with Elena's house number, then repeated it again because his mind felt like it was splitting apart. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the breathing of someone in acute shock. The dispatcher asked him, Is the person conscious? Are they breathing? Caleb looked down at Elena's still form and checked. His hands hovered over her face, trying to feel for breath. I don't think so. She's not moving. She's not responding to me. The panic in his voice was so acute that the dispatcher had to tell him multiple times to slow down so she could understand him. Between fragmented sentences, Caleb kept repeating the same thing over and over. I didn't plan this. I just came to meet her. I swear I didn't plan this. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I didn't plan this. The dispatcher remained professional and calm, the way they're trained to do. Sir, help is on the way. I'm sending paramedics and police to your location. Stay on the line with me. Can you do that? Within minutes, the first sirens could be heard approaching the neighborhood. The sound of an ambulance siren wailing down the quiet residential street brought neighbors out of their homes. On the porch of the main house, Rosa Alvarez heard the sirens and instinctively knew something was terribly wrong. She walked toward the commotion, and when she saw the ambulance pulling up to her cousin's backyard unit, a sinking feeling overtook her. When she saw Elena's body on the porch and Caleb standing there, covered in shock, Rosa let out a scream that would haunt the neighborhood for weeks. Oh my God, Elena! Elena, what happened? What did you do? She screamed at Caleb, her voice raw with the kind of anguish that comes from losing someone you love. Caleb could only repeat, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But the words sounded hollow and meaningless in the face of what had happened. The paramedics arrived at 3:24 p.m., just 6 minutes after Caleb made the 911 call. They moved with the efficiency of people who've done this before, assessing the scene and immediately kneeling beside Elena. One paramedic checked her carotid pulse, while another assessed her pupils with a small flashlight. They were looking for any sign of life, any indication that resuscitation was possible. The seconds stretched out like hours. Rosa was crying, asking questions that nobody could answer yet. Caleb was standing nearby, in complete shock, watching the people trying to save the woman he'd just killed. One paramedic looked at another and shook his head slightly, a gesture so small that only medical professionals would recognize it for what it was. The acknowledgement that there was nothing to be done. The lead paramedic spoke quietly into his radio. Dispatch, we have a female, early 30s with severe head trauma. There's no pulse, no signs of life. We're calling it. And then more quietly to the officers arriving on scene. There's no pulse. She's gone. The words hit Caleb like a second impact. He collapsed against the wall of the small house, his legs giving out beneath him. His voice came out as a wail. No, 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 God, what did I do? What did I do? He kept repeating it. A man watching his entire life implode in real time. Rosa was crying, her hands covering her mouth. Other neighbors had gathered at a distance, sensing that something terrible had happened, not yet understanding the full scope of the tragedy unfolding in front of them. Police officers arrived within seconds of the paramedics' declaration. They took in the scene, the shattered glass, Elena's motionless body, Caleb in a state of complete psychological collapse. One officer, a woman in her early 40s with experience in handling traumatic situations, approached Caleb calmly and carefully. Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and step away from the body, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Caleb complied without any resistance. He didn't argue or try to run. He looked like a man who had already surrendered to whatever was coming next. As Caleb stood, another officer began reading him his Miranda rights in a steady, practiced voice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Caleb wasn't really hearing the words. He was in a state of dissociation, watching his own life from outside his body. The officer placed handcuffs on his wrists, and Caleb offered no resistance. He was led to a police car and placed in the back seat, separated from the scene by a locked door and a metal barrier. From the window, he could see Rosa kneeling beside her cousin, crying, touching Elena's face one last time before the paramedics covered her body with a sheet. Elena's mother received a phone call at 3:47 p.m. on April 3rd, 2023. The voice on the other end was a police officer, and what she said would become the moment that divided Margaret Cruz's life into before and after. Ms. Cruz, I'm calling with some very difficult news. Your daughter Elena has been killed. There's been an incident at her residence. We need you to come to the Houston Police Department as soon as possible. The words didn't make sense. Margaret asked the officer to repeat what she'd said, convinced she'd misheard. But the words were the same the second time, and the third time. Her daughter was gone. The man her daughter had trusted and loved had taken her life in a moment of rage. By 5 p.m. that afternoon, the story was spreading across social media. Police scanners had picked up the call. News helicopters were circling above the small house in Houston. Within hours, Caleb Morgan's name and face would be known across the internet. And the questions would begin. How could this happen? What did he do? What was she hiding? But nobody yet understood the true complexity of what had occurred. That this wasn't a story with a villain and a victim, but rather a story about two wounded people whose collision would force the entire justice system to confront uncomfortable truths about deception, betrayal, and the fragile line between understanding and violence. By 6 a.m. on April 4th, 2023, the story of what had happened on a quiet Houston street was spreading across every social media platform in America. The local news outlets had picked it up first, with helicopter footage showing police vehicles outside the small backyard cottage. By 7 a.m., national news networks were beginning their coverage. By 9 a.m., the hashtags were trending on Twitter and TikTok. The initial headlines were sensational and incomplete, each one capturing only fragments of what had actually happened. One major outlet ran with "Man flies across country to meet online girlfriend, kills her within an hour." Another focused on a different angle. "Disabled woman found dead after meeting man from dating app." A third tried for a middle ground. "Online dating tragedy ends in death after 8-month romance." Each headline told a slightly different story, and each one was technically accurate, but fundamentally incomplete. The internet, as it always does, divided itself into opposing camps almost immediately. On one side were people who saw the situation in clear, unambiguous terms. A Twitter user with a blue check mark wrote, "Nothing justifies hitting a disabled woman. She was vulnerable. He was bigger and stronger. He could have walked away. Instead, he chose violence." This perspective gained traction quickly, especially among disability advocates and organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable populations. These voices were correct in their assertion that violence was never justified, but they were also concerned about a narrative that seemed to be forming, one that suggested Elena's deception had somehow contributed to her own death. "We need to be very careful here," one disability rights advocate wrote. "We cannot allow the story to become disabled woman's lie led to her death. That narrative blames her for being murdered. She made a mistake. She didn't deserve to die for that mistake." On the other side of the divide were people trying to understand the psychological dimensions of what had happened. These voices weren't defending Caleb's actions so much as attempting to contextualize them. One comment that circulated widely read, "He was emotionally devastated. 8 months of trust broken in one moment." I'm not excusing what he did, but catfishing and deception can actually break someone's mental health. The emotional betrayal was profound. Others took similar approaches, focusing on the lie rather than the disability. "This isn't about her body, it's about the deception. She built an entire relationship on a foundation of lies. That doesn't justify killing her, but it helps explain how a man with no history of violence could snap so completely." These conversations weren't defending violence, but they were attempting to understand the psychological mechanisms that had led to it. The media itself was struggling with how to frame the story responsibly. Some outlets continued to lead with her disability status, which disability advocates felt was dehumanizing and sensationalistic. Other outlets focused almost exclusively on the catfishing angle, which Elena's family felt was reductive and blamed her for her own death. The most responsible coverage tried to acknowledge both dimensions of the tragedy, that Elena had made serious choices about deception and that Caleb had made a violent choice in response, without suggesting that one caused the other or that either was justified. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers or generate clicks, so the sensational coverage dominated. Elena's family released a statement through their attorney on April 5th, 3 days after her death. Elena was a person, not a headline, Rosa said, her voice steady but filled with grief. She struggled with loneliness and isolation. She made mistakes in how she handled her relationship with Caleb. But Elena did not deserve to die. Nobody deserves to die because they lied about who they were. She was our cousin, our daughter, our sister, and she deserved better than this. The statement was dignified and restrained, acknowledging Elena's imperfections without diminishing the fact that her life had value and shouldn't have been taken. Caleb's family gave fewer interviews, but when his mother, Carol, did speak to a local news station on April 6th, her words were carefully chosen. "My son is not a violent person. I raised him to value honesty and integrity. Whatever happened in Houston, whatever caused him to act the way he acted, that is not who he is. That is not the man I raised." Darren, Caleb's best friend, also spoke publicly, though his statement was more complicated. "Caleb is not a monster. I've known him for 25 years, but he broke. I've never seen him break before, but he broke. And I don't know if anyone could have predicted that breaking point or stopped it once it came." The broader conversation that emerged from this tragedy was uncomfortable and necessary. People began asking questions that didn't have easy answers. How should we handle deception in online relationships? What responsibility do people have to disclose significant information about themselves? And what's considered significant? Can emotional overload ever serve as a mitigating factor in violence? How does disability discrimination in society contribute to situations where disabled people feel compelled to hide who they are? These questions hung over the narrative as the legal system began to move forward. 3 months later, on July 10th, 2023, Caleb Morgan stood in a Harris County courtroom in downtown Houston, facing a jury that would have to answer these questions not philosophically, but legally. The trial would become a battleground where prosecution and defense would fight not just over facts, but over the very nature of responsibility, betrayal, and the limits of human endurance. What neither side could have predicted was how the evidence presented would complicate everyone's understanding of what had really happened that day. If you haven't subscribed and liked the video, make sure you do so now. Hit that subscribe button. Thank you. The Harris County Courthouse is an imposing structure of gray stone and glass that sits in the heart of downtown Houston. On July 10, 2023, nearly 3 months after Elena Cruz's death, Caleb Morgan stood before Judge Patricia Hernandez in courtroom 301. The courtroom was packed with media, family members, and curious onlookers who'd followed the case through social media and news coverage. The jury, 12 Houston residents who'd been selected through voir dire over 2 days, sat in the jury box looking serious and attentive. Judge Hernandez was a 20-year veteran of the bench, known for running a tight courtroom and for her willingness to allow juries to grapple with the complexity of cases rather than oversimplifying them. She gavelled the courtroom to order at 9 a.m. sharp. The prosecution's case, led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb, opened with a straightforward narrative that left no room for ambiguity. Webb was a methodical prosecutor in his mid-50s, someone who believed that juries responded best to clarity rather than complexity. He stood before the jury and began his opening statement in a steady, measured voice. Elena Cruz was 3 feet 2 inches tall. She lived in a small house behind her cousin's property. She was in her own home, in a space she'd adapted to fit her body, when a man she'd invited into her life, a stranger really, despite 8 months of conversation, struck her with a heavy glass object. The defendant was not in danger. He was not under immediate threat. He was upset, and when he became upset, he chose violence. The law does not permit us to use emotional shock as a defense for striking someone. especially not a disabled woman in her own home who weighed less than 100 pounds. Webb's strategy was methodical and designed to strip away any sympathy for Caleb's emotional state. He presented photographs of Elena at family gatherings, images that showed the physical disparity between her and the people around her. He called Rosa to testify about Elena's fundamental goodness, her kindness, her desperate loneliness, and her past experiences of rejection. When Rosa described how Elena had been treated by David, how she'd been hidden and ashamed of in public, Webb used it to establish that Elena's fear of rejection was understandable and human. Elena didn't want to be seen as disabled first, Rosa testified, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She wanted to be seen as a person. That doesn't make what she did right, but it makes it human, and it certainly doesn't make it deserving of death. Webb walked the jury through the 8-month timeline of messages, calls, and video conversations with surgical precision. At no point did Elena claim to be tall. At no point did she claim to be able-bodied. What she did was allow the defendant to make assumptions. And yes, those assumptions were based on incomplete information, but incomplete information is not the same as explicit lies. She never said she was 6 feet tall. She never said she could walk without assistance. She simply allowed him to fill in the blanks. Webb then shifted his focus to the physical reality of what had happened. The defendant weighed 190 pounds. Elena weighed approximately 80 to 90 pounds. This was not a fair fight. This was not a situation of mutual combat or self-defense. This was a larger, stronger man striking a smaller, disabled woman in her own home. He had multiple opportunities to remove himself from that situation. He chose violence instead. The defense, led by attorney Jennifer Martinez, opened with a different narrative entirely. Martinez was younger than Webb, in her early 40s, and she had a reputation for finding the humanity in her clients. She looked at the jury with genuine sadness in her eyes. Caleb Morgan has no criminal record. He has never been arrested. He has never been in a fight. He is a man who worked hard his entire life, who valued honesty and integrity, and who tried to do the right thing every single day. But he is also a man who, after 2 serious betrayals by women he trusted, developed an acute sensitivity to dishonesty. He built walls to protect himself emotionally. And on April 3, 2023, when he arrived in Houston expecting to meet one woman and instead encountered a completely different reality, those walls didn't just crack, they shattered entirely. Martinez's strategy was to acknowledge the death while contextualizing Caleb's psychological state at the moment of the act. What happened that day was not premeditated. It was not planned. Caleb did not fly to Texas with the intention of hurting anyone. He flew to Texas expecting to meet someone he loved and had trusted for 8 months. When confronted with the revelation that the foundation of that trust had been constructed on deception, his mind broke. Not as an excuse, but as an explanation. We will show you evidence of a man with no history of violence, a man who has always walked away from conflict, a man whose immediate response after this terrible moment was to call for help rather than flee the scene. During the testimony phase, Rosa was called by the prosecution, but her words benefited both sides. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, she struggled to defend Elena's actions, but refused to condemn her motivations. She didn't want to be seen first as disabled. She wanted to be seen as a person, Rosa repeated, and the jury seemed to absorb the complexity of that statement. It wasn't a justification, but it was an explanation that humanized Elena in a way that made the jury understand her desperation without excusing her deception. Caleb's mother, Carol Morgan, testified for the defense with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of showing up and doing what's right. She described her son's childhood, his value system, the way he'd been raised to prize honesty. When the prosecution cross-examined her and asked whether she thought her son was capable of violence, Carol hesitated for a long moment. "Not the Caleb I raised, not the Caleb I know," she said finally. "But on that day, I don't think he was himself. I don't think he was in his right mind. Something broke inside him that he couldn't repair in that moment." Caleb himself took the stand on July 13th against the advice of his attorneys. It was a risky decision, but he felt compelled to explain himself to the jury. When the defense attorney asked him to describe the moment he saw Elena in the doorway, Caleb's voice was steady but filled with anguish. It wasn't shock because she wasn't attractive. I didn't think that. It was shock because I realized 8 months of my life had been based on incomplete information. Everything I believed about who she was, where she lived, how she lived, it was all built on something that wasn't true. When the prosecution asked him why he picked up the glass and swung it, Caleb struggled to find words. I don't know. I panicked. I felt betrayed. I felt humiliated. All at once, everything crashed down. I wasn't thinking. I was just reacting to the weight of it all. The prosecutor pressed him, but you made a choice. You made the choice to pick up that glass and strike her with it. Caleb's response was the most honest moment of the trial. I didn't make a choice. A choice implies deliberation, and there was no deliberation. There was only breaking. And I've spent every day since wishing I had made a different choice, even though in that moment there was no choice to make. There was just the breaking and what came out of it. Expert testimony followed from both sides. The prosecution's expert, a clinical psychologist, testified that emotional distress, even severe emotional distress, does not cause violence. People experience betrayal every day. They experience humiliation. They experience the shattering of their assumptions about someone they love. And the vast majority of them do not resort to violence. Alternatives existed. Mr. Morgan could have walked away. He could have cried. He could have yelled. He made the choice to be violent. The defense's expert, another psychologist with expertise in trauma and emotional regulation, offered a different perspective. In rare cases, when someone with a history of betrayal trauma experiences a deception of this magnitude, where the fundamental assumptions they've built about a relationship are revealed to be false in a single moment, their emotional regulation systems can fail catastrophically. This is a breakdown, not a decision. It doesn't excuse the outcome, but it helps explain how a non-violent person can act violently. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They asked for clarification on the legal definitions of premeditated murder versus voluntary manslaughter versus assault causing death. They wrestled with the same questions the public had been wrestling with. Can deception cause violence? Yes. Does it excuse violence? No. Was this planned? No. Was it his fault? Yes. On July the 15th, 2023 at 3:47 p.m., the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant Caleb Morgan guilty of manslaughter with excessive force. It was a verdict that acknowledged both his responsibility and the context in which his action occurred. It rejected the idea that he was a premeditated murderer while affirming that he had caused Elena's death through his own actions. At the sentencing hearing on August 2nd, Judge Hernandez addressed Caleb directly with words that would be quoted in every article about the case. Mr. Morgan, this court has heard extensive testimony about your character, your work ethic, and your lack of prior violence. I believe those testimonies to be credible. You are not a serial killer. You are not a calculating murderer, but a woman is dead. Elena Cruz is gone because of your actions on April 3rd. While I understand the emotional circumstances that preceded the incident, I cannot ignore the fact that you made a choice in that moment. You picked up an object and you struck her. The judge paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. The law cannot account for human frailty. It cannot excuse betrayal or justify violence. But we must be honest about the circumstances that led us here. A woman who was afraid of rejection, a man who could not tolerate deception, and a moment where neither of them could undo what they had set in motion. Judge Hernandez sentenced Caleb Morgan to 22 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. As deputies led him away, Caleb paused and turned toward Elena's family. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was heard throughout the silent courtroom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Rosa Alvarez didn't nod forgiveness, but she did acknowledge the apology with a slight nod, not absolving him of responsibility, but recognizing the sincerity of his remorse. The verdict did not resolve anything. It only documented what had happened and assign legal consequences to those actions. But the real questions, the ones that mattered beyond the courthouse, remained unanswered. What do we do about loneliness in the digital age? What responsibility do people have to disclose who they truly are? And most importantly, how do we prevent the next tragedy that's hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when two broken people collide? Today, Caleb Morgan is 43 years old. He sits in a cell at the Estelle Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, a maximum security facility located near Huntsville, about 50 miles north of where Elena died. He has been incarcerated for 18 months. Under the terms of his 22-year sentence, he will be eligible for parole in the year 2041, when he will be 60 years old. That is, if the parole board decides he's been rehabilitated enough to walk back into a world that will remember him for what he did on a single afternoon in April. He spends his days working in the prison kitchen, serving food to other inmates, and attending mandatory counseling sessions where he talks about the moment that destroyed multiple lives. Lives that extended far beyond just Elena's. Rosa Alvarez has spent the last 18 months in a different kind of prison. It's the kind that exists inside your own mind, where you replay conversations you had with someone who is now gone, where you remember small moments that took on enormous significance only after they died. She's processed Elena's death through therapy and support groups and late-night conversations with her own family, trying to make sense of how her cousin could have made such a choice, trying to understand the desperation that led Elena to believe hiding herself was the only way to be loved. She's also had to defend her cousin's memory against media narratives that reduced Elena to a cautionary tale about catfishing, against people who seem to blame her for her own death by focusing only on the deception and not on the fear that motivated it. Elena's parents, Margaret and Carlos, are older now in ways that have nothing to do with the passage of time. Grief ages people differently than years do. It carves lines into faces and puts weight on shoulders that shouldn't have to bear it. They've given a handful of carefully controlled interviews to media outlets, always emphasizing that their daughter was a whole person, not a headline, not a cautionary tale, not a lesson about the dangers of online dating. Margaret still works as a nurse at the same hospital where she's worked for 30 years, and colleagues say she's more quiet than she used to be, more withdrawn, as if grief has taken up residence inside her and doesn't plan on leaving. Carlos retired early, unable to focus on the work he loved after his youngest child was murdered. They've started a small foundation in Elena's name dedicated to supporting disabled women's access to mental health services, turning their daughter's tragedy into advocacy for others in similar circumstances. The deception Elena engaged in was not born from malice. It wasn't a calculated scheme designed to hurt Caleb or manipulate him for entertainment or profit. It came from fear, the kind of fear that develops over years of rejection, over being stared at, over being fetishized, over being told implicitly and explicitly that your body makes you less worthy of love and respect. She was terrified of being rejected for her physical form before anyone had the chance to know her mind, her humor, her capacity to love deeply and genuinely. That fear is almost universal among people with visible disabilities. It's rooted in real experience, in real rejection, in real discrimination. But deception, even deception that emerges from legitimate fear and hurt, still carries consequences that ripple outward in ways the person deceiving can't always control or predict. Elena's choice to hide her reality robbed Caleb of something fundamental, the ability to make an informed decision about who he wanted to be in relationship with. It forced him to make that choice at the worst possible moment, when his emotional state was already shattered. Caleb's sensitivity to dishonesty wasn't a character flaw or a weakness. It was a wound that had been inflicted and then repeatedly irritated. Rachel had lied to him about her financial responsibility. Maya had hidden her living situation. These weren't abstract deceptions. They were lies about how these women were actually living their lives, about fundamental facts about their circumstances that changed the entire context of their relationships. Those experiences had taught Caleb that the world couldn't be trusted, that people who claimed to love him would still betray him, that honesty was something he'd have to guard and protect obsessively or lose again. He'd built walls around his heart, high, thick walls designed to keep out the kind of pain that felt unsurvivable. For years, those walls served him well. They kept him from rushing into relationships, from being vulnerable with people who hadn't earned his trust. But walls have a limitation that their architects don't always anticipate. They don't just protect you from pain, they also concentrate pressure. When enough weight is applied from the outside, when the foundations those walls are built upon are suddenly revealed to be unstable, the entire structure doesn't gradually weaken. It shatters all at once, and everything inside, all the accumulated pain, all the unprocessed betrayal, all the rage at being lied to again, comes pouring out with a force that can't be controlled, stopped, or taken back. Elena lived in a society that has spent her entire life sending her a specific message. Your body is something to be ashamed of, something to hide, something that makes you less deserving of love and acceptance than people whose bodies fit conventional standards. That's not Elena's responsibility to fix. That's a fundamental failure of the world around her. A failure of cultural systems and social norms that have for centuries treated disability as something to be pitied or hidden rather than accepted and accommodated. The disability rights community was absolutely right to push back against media narratives that blamed Elena for her own death or suggested that her deception somehow justified violence against her. She did not deserve to die. There is no lie about who you are that justifies being struck and killed by someone you've trusted. And yet acknowledging those profound truths doesn't prevent us from asking another question, one that's equally important. What would have been different if Elena had lived in a world where she felt genuinely safe being honest about who she was? What if she hadn't internalized the messages that her body was something shameful or unlovable? What if she'd had access to examples of disabled people in relationships where they were fully accepted, fully seen, fully loved for their complete and authentic selves? These questions linger in the space after the verdict, after the cameras have moved on to cover the next tragedy, after the public has absorbed the lesson and moved forward. How many people are reading this right now, tonight, building relationships online based on carefully constructed versions of themselves that exclude crucial information about who they actually are? How many people are walking around carrying betrayal trauma so deep that they can't handle even small deceptions? Who are one disappointed expectation away from breaking in ways they can't predict or control? How many disabled people are still hiding who they are because they've learned through painful experience that honesty comes with a price? And perhaps most importantly, how many more tragedies will we witness before we ask ourselves the fundamental question? What kind of world are we building where honesty feels impossible and deception feels like survival? Caleb Morgan and Elena Cruz were not villains in any traditional sense. They were not evil people making calculated choices to harm others. They were ordinary people, broken in ordinary ways, carrying wounds that were both deeply personal and heartbreakingly universal. She was afraid, afraid in the way that comes from years of being rejected and judged for her body. He was wounded, wounded in the way that comes from trusting people and having that trust weaponized against him. And in a single moment of collision, in the space of seconds, both of their fears became fatal. The trial produced a legal verdict that assigned responsibility and consequence, and that was necessary and appropriate. The jury had to render a decision based on law and evidence. But the verdict did not resolve the moral questions that this case raised. It only documented the legal ones. This is not a story about judging either of them. It's about understanding that ordinary people, carrying ordinary pain, can create extraordinary tragedies that no one saw coming, that no one planned for, that no one imagined possible until the moment when it became real. It's about recognizing that we live in a world where disconnection has become the default, where people build entire relationships with strangers without ever fully revealing themselves, where fear and shame drive us to hide fundamental truths about who we are. If we genuinely want to prevent the next tragedy like this one, and there will be others if we don't, we need to do better. We need to create a world where disabled people feel genuinely safe being honest about who they are without fear of rejection or fetishization. We need to support people who carry deep wounds from betrayal so that their pain doesn't transform into something that makes them fragile and reactive. We need to commit to building relationships on the foundation of complete truth, not partial honesty or strategically hidden information. And we need to acknowledge that loneliness has become an epidemic in America, that it's making people desperate enough to hide who they are, desperate enough to deceive the people they claim to love, desperate enough to do almost anything to feel seen and accepted by another human being. The story of Caleb Morgan and Elena Cruz ends in a prison cell and in grief, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story for the rest of us. Every single person who has watched this, every person who has listened to these names and these details and felt the weight of this tragedy has the power to change the narrative. You have the power to be honest in your relationships. You have the power to accept people in their full complexity. You have the power to build a world where deception doesn't feel like survival and where honesty doesn't come with the price of rejection. The question is, starting today, will you? If this story made you think differently about online relationships, about the people you connect with behind screens, about the ways we hide ourselves and the consequences of that hiding, then subscribe to this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story that needs to be told, the next tragedy that deserves to be understood, the next reminder that ordinary people can create extraordinary consequences through ordinary choices. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done differently? If you'd been Caleb, would you have walked away when you saw Elena? If you'd been Elena, would you have found the courage to tell him the truth before he arrived? What would you have done in those moments when fear and betrayal and hurt all collided at once? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. Don't just consume this story and move on. Engage with it. Think about it. Share your perspective, because this conversation, this dialogue between us, is how we begin to understand what happened and why. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Share it with someone you're in a relationship with. Share it with someone who's building a life online. Share it with someone who carries betrayal trauma and doesn't understand why they react so intensely to deception. Share it with someone who's hiding who they are because they're afraid of rejection. Because the more we pay attention to stories like this one, the more we understand the human cost of deception, and the more carefully we build our relationships, the more we can prevent the next tragedy that's hiding in plain sight, waiting to happen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to listen to Caleb Morgan and Elena Cruz's story all the way to the end. Please share your thoughts in the comment. I'm watching all.